Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with the meeting now. Welcome, everybody, to our discussion of the Utility Wildfire General Order. My name is Robert Stoddard, and I'm an environmental scientist with the State Water Board. I'm here with a few other Water Board staff and managers who I'll introduce on the next slide. We have a presentation on the General Order, and then we'll have a Q&A session after. This is an official Water Board public outreach meeting and will be recorded. Comments will not be accepted at this meeting. The goal of this meeting is to provide an overview of the order and the changes since the last draft, and an opportunity for the public to ask clarifying questions to inform written comments that are due April 29th. We'll take questions during the presentation and at the end. Please make sure questions are related to the current slide, otherwise hold the questions until the end. Please remain muted and use the raise hand feature to indicate you would like to speak, and we'll call upon speakers in the order that the hands are raised. Next slide, please. I want to take a minute to introduce the Water Board staff who will be participating in this meeting. We have Phil Crater, Nick Martirano, Paul Hahn, Jean Bandura, Serena Liu, and Liz Reese. Please go ahead and introduce yourselves in the order of the slide if you are currently on.
I'll start and let Phil jump in if he needs to. Nick Martirano, Assistant Deputy Director, Division of Water Quality over the Service Water Branch. Paul?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, Paul Hahn, I'm the Program Manager for the Watersheds and Wetlands Program.
Jean Bandura, Senior Environmental Scientist in the Watersheds and Wetlands section. Thanks for your time being here today.
Hi, this is Phil Crater at the State Water Board, Division of Water Quality. Appreciate everybody's time and look forward to good discussion today. Thank you.
I'm Liz Reese. Oh, sorry, Serena's trying to speak here. All right, I'll jump in. I'm Liz Reese, environmental scientist in the Watersheds and Wetlands section.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. First, we're going to go ahead and give a broad overview of the general order, including the purpose, scope, and types of activities covered. Then we're going to go over some of the significant changes that were made from the draft that was released in June and highlight some specific changes that we made in response to the comments. Then we will briefly discuss the Governor's emergency proclamation for fuels reduction work and overlap with other water board permits, including the CGP. Finally, we'll discuss cost of compliance, the adoption timeline, and next steps. We'll leave time at the end for Q&A. As a reminder, the revised draft is posted on the State Water Board 401 website and is available for public comment until April 29th. Comments must be received by the board clerk by 5 p.m. on the 29th. The content of this presentation is substantially similar to the presentation that we gave on Monday, so if you attended that one, the information is going to be mostly the same. Next slide, please. First, I want to discuss the scope. We previously received comments about the administrative burden on permittees due to the high number of projects that would be covered under this order. We made several changes to the scope to reduce the number of projects expected to require coverage compared to the prior draft, and we'll discuss those changes shortly. We did not, however, change the high-level scope. The general order serves as both a 401 water quality certification under the Clean Water Act and waste discharge requirements. As a result, it also covers some activities outside of waters, which means it has a broader scope than a regular 401. The order requires coverage for soil disturbing activities conducted by electric utilities for the purpose of wildfire prevention and mitigation, post-fire response, and operations and maintenance, as long as the activity-specific coverage criteria are met. The scope is statewide, but does not cover activities in urban areas as defined by the 2020 U.S. Census, unless within a California Public Utilities Commission high fire threat district. We received comments that all urban areas should be excluded because activities in paved environments where there is no risk of impacts to waters would be pulled in. Other changes were made to ensure that paved areas were excluded, but we decided not to fully exclude urban areas. We looked at available mapping data and found that there are many communities defined as urban areas by the 2020 U.S. Census, where there are also sizable wildland-urban interfaces, watercourses in or near the community, and pervious surfaces. Project activities in these areas may present risks to waters, so we included these areas to ensure that such activities are covered by the general order. It's important to note that urban areas dominated by impervious surfaces, such as developed areas paved in concrete or asphalt, would be excluded from general order coverage, since such activities, aside from vegetation management and herbicide application, require soil disturbance before general order coverage is required. Next slide, please. There are now 11 activity categories that are covered by the general order. These activities are listed in section 3, A through K. These activities are vegetation management, herbicide application, site access development and maintenance, staging areas and laydown yards, pole and tower repairs, maintenance or replacement, substation maintenance, structural conversion, overhead line reconductoring, undergrounding power lines, boardwalk repairs and replacement, and electric utility infrastructure lowering, maintenance, replacement, or removal. Previously, there were 12 categories with a separate category for transmission tower maintenance. That activity is still covered but has been combined with pole maintenance. Next slide, please. There were quite a few revisions from the June 2024 draft, but I wanted to highlight the 6 most significant. As mentioned previously, we received comments about the administrative burden and the number of projects that would require enrollment. We also received comments requesting soil disturbance thresholds, elimination of slope and soil erodibility as coverage criteria, reclassifying vegetation management as a low-threat activity, and removing monitoring for low-risk projects. We have made most of the changes proposed in those comments to focus the general order scope on larger-scale activities and activities closer to waters, simplify coverage and the enrollment process, and clarify requirements. First, we added a 0.5-acre soil disturbance size threshold for certain activities. Second, we revised the non-notifying category, Category A, requirements and eligibility criteria. Third, we added a consolidated enrollment option for the notifying category, Category B, projects that meet certain criteria, which allows for streamlined permitting without the need for the full permitting process. Fourth, we removed the term controllable sediment discharge source due to confusion surrounding the term and replaced it with the term erosion and sediment control. Fifth, we revised the inspection requirements for non-notifying projects so that dischargers only need to inspect 5% of all non-notifying projects per year. Finally, we added a summary table that outlines the non-notifying category eligibility criteria. This table is found in Attachment A. Attachment A is linked at the bottom of this PowerPoint, at the bottom of the slide. These slides will be posted online after the meeting, so any links can be accessed through those slides. So next, we'll go a bit deeper into some of the specifics for some of these changes. Next slide, please. As mentioned in the previous slide, we wanted to focus the general order scope on larger scale activities and activities close to waters. Each activity listed in Section 3 of the general order has specific criteria for when coverage is triggered. All activities except access route work and vegetation management are now covered when they result in soil disturbance within 50 feet of waters. We received a significant number of comments recommending that we remove the slope and erodibility criteria, and we did for most activity types. For the activities that still have slope and erodibility criteria, we added a size threshold of 0.5 acre. These activities are vegetation management, staging areas and laydown yards, and infrastructure lowering, maintenance, replacement, and removal. Vegetation management is also covered if it occurs within 50 feet of waters, while the other 2 activities are covered if they result in soil disturbance within 50 feet of waters. There is a small distinction there. Vegetation management does not require soil disturbance within 50 feet of waters, while the other 2 activities do. We decided to keep the slope and erodibility criteria for these activities because these activities often may result in substantial amounts of soil disturbance. and when they occur on steep slopes and erodible soils, there's a much higher likelihood of sediment delivery to waters. Finally, access route development maintenance is covered if it results in 300 linear feet of soil disturbance or soil disturbance within 500 feet of waters. The distance criteria is higher for access route work due to the higher potential for discharges to waters across larger distances when working on access routes. As a side note, we define soil disturbance in the glossary to add clarity. I see we have a hand. Josh?
Yeah, thank you, Josh Stoops for SMUD. I think, you know, this is one of the areas that we're still kind of wrestling with to wrap our minds around. And I guess, you know, on these project activity categories, would it be accurate to say that the revised GO will regulate activities that do not currently require a waste discharge requirement or another water quality permit?
Hi, that smile is for staff handing me the microphone. This is Paul Han. Hey, so I want to be clear about where we sit with this. So first of all, the activities that our agency regulates are discharges of waste or threatened discharges into waters of the state.
Well, your audio is very broken up.
Is this better? I'm putting the microphone closer to me.
That sounds good to
Can you
me.
hear me now?
Paul, you're coming through loud and clear, I think, for some of us. I'm not sure if there's a technical problem with some of us and not others.
Okay. I'm going to move on. I would invite you, if you cannot hear me, give me a call afterwards. I'm happy to chat with you. So I want to be really clear that our agency's mandate is to address discharges of waste into waters of the state and threatened discharges into waters of the state. We have a number of regulatory programs that we use to do this. In this particular area, there has been a widespread use of a exemption from the CGP for existing maintenance activities that don't require the CGP, but nevertheless, the waste discharge or the threat of waste discharge still exists and still is part of what we would be looking at for as part of our regulatory mandate. So we are looking at closing what we see as some loopholes in the CGP, and we are making sure that we are addressing activities that frankly were done infrequently enough that it wasn't something that we were willing to use staff resources towards. They kind of fell underneath the radar, but with the increased pace and scale and all the work that's being done out there, we just aren't in a position to ignore that anymore. So this is an area where we're trying to establish good baseline management practices in a way that is reasonable and appropriate. We are trying to make sure that we establish a permit program that is administratively thin and light. This is specifically with the road work, something that many utility companies may not be used to, but it's certainly within the scope of our authorities.
Paul, can I jump in real quick? Because I heard a different question there. I think the question I heard was whether or not I think the question I heard was how our order will interplay or won't interplay with the governor's executive order on wildfire. And if that is the question that I heard, could you just confirm that and I'll go ahead and try and answer?
No, I think it was closer to what Paul was trying to answer. I did have a couple of follow-up questions, though, if this is a good time to ask those.
I just wanted to make sure you were getting the answers you needed. I apologize, Paul. I heard the question differently, but I'm glad I asked and I'll stand down.
Yeah, well, that's what this meeting is for. So, we have a few more slides, and it sounds like you want to dig deeper into this issue. Why don't we hold that question? We'll revisit it after we go through our slides. Does that work for you?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, great. Thanks. Appreciate it. Robert? Back to you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Josh. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. As part of our efforts to focus on higher risk activities and reduce the administrative burden on permittees, we modified the structure of the order. We modified the structure of the non-notifying category. Coverage under the non-notifying category is now based on only 3 criteria, which I will discuss more on the next slide. Non-notifying projects still need to apply all BMPs and fulfill the tribal cultural resource conditions. No report is required for the tribal cultural resources for non-notifying projects. These projects are non-notifying except for certain vegetation management projects. Because the changes to the non-notifying category would greatly increase the number of projects covered, there was concern that Water Board staff would not know what work was occurring or where. As a result, a list of all non-notifying projects must be maintained, along with certain minimal details regarding each project, such as location, dates, and a brief description. This list must be made available to Water Board staff if requested. Finally, we received comments requesting that we limit monitoring to higher risk notifying projects. Due to the potential number of projects enrolled in the non-notifying category, many projects would not be monitored at all and would have no mechanism for identifying and remedying BMP failures or erosion. As a result, we decided to require a limited number of inspections for non-notifying projects. Only 5% of non-notifying projects must be inspected, and a copy of the report must be held for 3 years. No reporting is necessary after the inspection unless the inspection identified a BMP failure or erosion. Notifying projects still cover higher risk activities and require full reporting. BMPs must be implemented for notifying projects, and the Tribal Cultural Resource Report must be submitted. Notification is required for all notifying Category B projects. All projects under this category must be inspected according to the conditions in the general order, and the results must be reported as laid out in Attachment E. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in the last slide, the non-notifying eligibility criteria have changed since the previous draft. We received comments that 404F exemptions are very useful for streamlining of utility projects and should be moved into the non-notifying category as a result. We agreed with this assessment and moved projects covered under a 404F exemption into this category. This ensures that water quality goals are met while the streamlining objectives are achieved. Now, all projects must not result in a discharge of dredge or fill materials unless a Clean Water Act 404F exemption applies. This criteria applies to all potential non-notifying projects. For clarification, Clean Water Act Section 404F1B exempt projects are for the purpose of maintenance, including emergency reconstruction of recently damaged parts, of currently serviceable structures such as dikes, dams, levees, groins, riprap, breakwaters, causeways, and bridge abutments or approaches, and transportation structures. The next change was based around our continuing efforts to reduce the administrative burden on permittees and focus on the highest risk activities. We wanted to make sure that the notifying category covered only the highest risk projects with the highest likelihood of impacts to waters, and that the lower risk projects would not require the full reporting and notification requirements. As a result, we changed the activities covered by the non-notifying category. If project activities are limited to vegetation management, herbicide application, pole and tower repairs, maintenance or replacement, substation maintenance, structural conversion, overhead line reconductoring, undergrounding of power lines, or electric utility infrastructure lowering, maintenance, replacement, or removal, the project is eligible for the non-notifying category, assuming no discharge of dredge or fill materials will result. Finally, if project activities are limited to certain access route activities discussed on the next slide, the project is eligible for the non-notifying category, again assuming no discharge of dredge or fill materials will result. Next slide, please. Previously, we covered all access route activities under the notifying category. We received comments that certain access route activities are beneficial to water quality, and requiring a full notice of intent for such work would be an obstacle for such beneficial activities. As a result, we moved certain access route maintenance activities into the non-notifying category to make it easier for dischargers to perform beneficial access route work. The access route activities now covered by the non-notifying category are applying gravel to existing road surfaces, clean out or armoring of cross-drain culvert outfalls, inboard ditches, and ditch relief culverts, installing additional inboard ditch relief culverts, armoring cut slopes above roads, maintaining or adding rolling dips or rolling dip leadouts, stabilizing existing fill slopes, and surface blading. Next slide, please. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Jean, who's going to finish off the presentation with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. I'm Jean Bandura, Senior Environmental Scientist with the State Water Board. And just as a heads up, I'm going to touch on a number of topics based on past interest on this project, so I'll be jumping around just a bit. Please let me know if you'd like more detail on any particular topic while we're on that slide, or when we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation. Just so you know where we are timing-wise, we're a bit over halfway done with the presentation, so we'll have plenty of time for back and forth. As Robert mentioned, the most common comments were focused on the administrative burden of the prior draft. In consideration, we've added a process that can be followed in lieu of having to submit a full notice of intent. Notifying Category B projects may apply for coverage following the process listed on the screen. Note that this optional enrollment path only applies to upland activities. To apply, utilities with approved programmatic plans could submit a description of planned work, location information, construction dates, best management practices, and the Tribal and Cultural Resources Report. And if utilities do not receive notification that information listed on the slide is missing, work may proceed after 30 days. The general order conditions still cover activities like environmental monitoring, erosion and sediment control, access routes, and stream crossings. And I'll highlight a few key changes made in response to comments. We reorganized some sections to improve clarity and usability of the order. We also revised the environmental monitoring and training requirements to clarify that training can be developed by anyone as long as it was developed by someone familiar with environmental resources. This goal is to ensure that everybody on site understands how to protect resources and avoid unintentional impacts. We added flexibility to several condition categories, including the hydrologic disconnection related conditions for access routes to reflect reasonable expectations while still protecting water quality. And as one specific update, we revised the horizontal drilling conditions to allow for nighttime drilling, provided the line is clearly visible to detect any frac outs. Moving on to another topic, several private utilities commented on the increased workload to comply with the tribal resource conditions found in the general order. Some specific concerns included the potential administrative demand and delays caused by the tribal coordination requirement, particularly for lower impact projects and non-notifying activities. The pre-project notification timeline of 120 days being incompatible with utility planning. Projects that already have consultation being conducted through another agency would be doubling their efforts. The tribal resource conditions were largely maintained because they're in line with the State Water Board's racial equity resolution and the associated action plan. Additionally, input from tribes during consultation was clear about the desire to not only be notified, but have the opportunity to provide meaningful input prior to beginning work. However, in consideration of the feedback provided by utilities, some revisions have been made to the tribal resource conditions to ease the potential burden of compliance. We've reduced the time frame of this process from having to start 120 days before work begins to 30 days for contacting tribes prior to commencing work when tribal cultural resources are identified within the project area. We've removed the requirement for tribal coordination when a project already has consultation being conducted through another agency. And further, in recognition of the timely process of obtaining a sacred lands file search from the Native American Heritage Commission, staff have provided additional water board resources through the Office of Public Engagement, Equity, and Tribal Affairs to aid in tribal outreach and engagement. This is really a quick note on fees. In this instance, there's no change compared to the prior draft, but I am using the slide as a reminder that fees are required under the general order. Upland activities are subject to the waste discharge requirement fee schedule, and in-water work will continue to be subject to the dredge or fill portion of the fee schedule. Non-notifying Category A activities are not subject to fees. And the annual wildfire mitigation fees will continue to cover work conducted pursuant to a wildfire mitigation plan. These slides, as Robert said, will be posted on the Water Board's program page, and there's a link to the current fee schedule that's available there.
Gene, we have a hand up in the chat. Susie?
Hi, thank you. Susie Berlin for Northern California Power Agency and the Golden State Power Cooperative. I had a question on the discussion document or the answers to questions at the end. You have the discussion on cost consideration. Does that take into account all of the different fees, including the annual fees, or is it just well, that's it. Does it take into account all of the fees, including the annual fee that's on a mileage basis?
The cost consideration discussion is a comparison to current fees associated with current permitting requirements, and the annual wildfire mitigation plan fees are already being charged to electric utilities. So it doesn't take into consideration that specific fee.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, switching gears, there's an additional finding at the top of the general order that references the governor's recent emergency proclamation. On March 1st, 2025, the governor issued an emergency proclamation to suspend permitting requirements for critical fuel reduction projects, such as removal of hazardous dead and dying trees and removal of vegetation for community defensible space. Projects under the emergency proclamation have been authorized by the Cal EPA and natural resources agencies, or rather that have been authorized by CNRA and Cal EPA, are not subject to the general order. Those projects should follow the environmental protection plan that was developed by Cal EPA and the Natural Resources Agency, consistent with the application for coverage under the suspensions. For more information on the emergency proclamations, please navigate to the Wildfire Task Force page, which includes several FAQ documents and links to the request for suspension. We're also aware of a separate Governor Executive Order N2425 regarding utility projects in Los Angeles and Ventura counties related to the recent wildfire, and recognize that it could impact implementation of this general order for projects in the impacted area. We didn't see a need to add another clarifying finding or additional text to the general order, but we do recognize that it could similarly impact the applicability of the order as the emergency proclamation has. I want to now go over how the general order overlaps with other state water board and regional board permits. A relevant guiding principle is to minimize the number of permits necessary. And since this permit cannot replace existing permits, to provide a clear transition between permits that electric utilities are subject to, our goal is to reduce any overlapping requirements. So if a project qualifies for another dredge or fill permit that authorizes in-water work, then coverage must be obtained under that permit or general order. And then this general order doesn't apply. So some specific example of that are the Army Corps' emergency general permits 5, 9, and 63. And additional points of clarity were added to highlight that this general order, the utility wildfire general order, is not intended to cover emergency authorizations, since those other permits that I just mentioned and the statewide WDR is already in place to cover emergency action. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the construction general permit, since both the draft utility wildfire general order and the construction general permit, often called the CGP, cover soil disturbing activities. A project with all activities covered by the CGP does not require general order coverage. A project with only a part of its activities covered by the CGP, for example, construction of a project with an acre or more of soil disturbance that also results in in-water work, requires general order enrollment, but is exempt from certain conditions. As example, the SWIP requirement under the CGP satisfies the erosion and sediment control plan requirement of the utility wildfire general order. We also received comments from the utilities about the increased cost. There was just a question on this that the general order would impose. In response to those comments, we included a cost consideration discussion at the end of the responses to comments table. At the end of the table, we evaluated the general order's increased cost of compliance relative to current water board requirements. We acknowledged that the general order does introduce some new costs that are not part of the current requirements, in particular for upland activities and tribal consultation. However, many of the requirements align with the existing utility practices, such as preparing an erosion and sediment control plan and having on-site environmental monitors. The general order was revised. The general order was substantially revised compared to the prior draft to reduce costs by including a non-notifying Category A, consolidated enrollment option for Category B, and excluding low-threat projects such as those that are over 50 feet from waters from coverage altogether. Reductions in the number of activities that are subject to the permit should address some cost concerns.
Gene, we have another hand up. Josh?
Yeah, thanks for letting me ask another question. Josh Stoops from SMUD. On Monday, I'd asked, if there was, when you were developing the cost discussion, if there was an effort to estimate or quantify how many utility projects would be covered by the revised GO or the associated costs. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. I wanted to make sure I captured your response correctly. And I have a couple follow-up questions, but again, I can wait till the end to follow up on those.
Yeah, the short answer, Josh, is that we do not have an estimate on how many projects this would be affected by this. Again, as I mentioned on Monday, when we sent this out for the first round of comments, we heard back from the utility companies that this would potentially impact thousands of projects. And while we had no way to verify it, it did seem to be reasonable on its face, that concern. And so we have made a number of attempts to try and narrow the scope and narrow the administrative requirements of this permit. We'd like to think that we've hit a sweet spot, but we don't have a way of knowing how many projects this would potentially impact. We do expect that we will get this comment from the utility companies, and the one thing that we would ask is that if and when you provide that comment, we need some additional information about how you guys are coming up with that record. At this point, we believe that this should be a pretty thin and light permit, but we don't have any way of verifying just exactly how many projects would be impacted. And if you guys are aware of a methodology that we could use for that, we would be all ears to hear it.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Josh. Gene?
Thanks. So wrapping up here, on to the development timeline and next steps. So currently it's April 23rd. We're holding this public outreach meeting, which is being held during our comment period. We're requesting public comments on the draft general order that was released for comments on March 28th. And everyone has until April 29th to provide written comments on the draft. And at this time, board consideration of proposed adoption is tentatively scheduled for October of this year. Written comments will be accepted until April 29th at 5 p.m., as I just said, and instructions on how to submit a comment are on the public notice, which is available through the webpage that's shown on this slide. Lastly, if you have any questions that are not answered during today's presentation, you're welcome to reach out to myself directly, to anyone on our team that was introduced at the start of the presentation. It looks like we have another question from Susie Berlin.
Yes, thank you. Okay, sorry, I just lost my chain of thought there. Can you talk a little bit about the implementation timeline? You mentioned the approval date, and what can you speak to how that will impact or how you anticipate the implementation timeline working, please?
We aren't seeing the timeline through all the way to implementation quite yet. The reason for that is we just recently announced the second comment period on this draft. So implementation timing will be somewhat based on when staff have the time to go through all of the comments and revise the draft documents. And then we will meet with the board, and it's the board's determination how long the implementation timeline will be. So that's a question that we definitely are interested in on our side, and we know that the utilities will have to comply with the order interested in, but we aren't quite sure what that'll look like.
Thank you.
Okay, that actually wraps up our presentation. So now we're going to open it up for some more questions and answers, and I'm going to stop sharing the slides now.
Just a quick reminder, we're going to go ahead and do the same format as the rest of this presentation. If you'd like to speak, please go ahead and raise your hand, and we will call upon them in the order that we see them. Thank you. I see Josh Stoops.
Thanks. I was just going to go back to some of the placeholders I mentioned earlier. So Paul, when we were talking about the scope, you had mentioned that the water board was aiming to close a loophole for the construction general permit. And I guess I hadn't maybe picked up on that. Is that goal noted anywhere in the record in this proceeding?
Yes, thank you, Gene. Yes, I believe we discussed that in our CEQA scoping process in regards to making sure that we're covering the waste discharges that come out of the right of way, and I'm pretty sure it's in our responses to comments, though I wouldn't be able to cite you chapter and verse. If you'd like me to follow up with you later, I'm happy to do so.
Oh, that's okay. I can try to dig through those. So it'd be maybe in the draft EIR. Is that what you're referencing?
Yeah, and
okay.
Yeah, and it may be easier for me to just kind of spend a little bit more time laying out the context here. So again, our agency deals with discharges of waste to water the state. Now, in many cases, we have general orders that provide a streamlined process for discharges of waste to water the state. When we write those orders, in some cases, we can exempt discharges. In other cases, we can say, hey, this permit is limited to these types of discharges. What that leaves is that other sources of waste that may be outside of the purview of another order aren't necessarily exempted from water board authority or jurisdiction. And in those cases, and a good example of this is when we do general permits under a 401 certification. If you can qualify under a general certification, that's great. If you can't fall under a general certification, we generally require an individual certification. So we're taking kind of the same view with some of the waste discharges that have been identified as qualifying under the maintenance exemption under the CGP. And so we view that these are still waste discharges. They still require coverage. We recognize that in some cases, many of these would be captured under the CGP. In other cases, they wouldn't be. And so rather than asking people to come in and provide a report of waste discharge and ask for individual waste discharge requirements, we're trying to cover them under this order. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I guess I'm just I think I hadn't come across the reference or to the loophole exemption in the CGP, so it's helpful to hear that that's part of your thinking. I guess kind of a follow-up to that.
And in full disclosure, I don't think we discuss it in terms of a loophole within the CGP, but I do believe we discussed the CGP and the relationship to the CGP in the responses to comments.
So I guess one of the things I think we've heard kind of throughout the process from staff is that this revised general order will help streamline the process and facilitate utility maintenance work. And I guess I'm trying to square that with, covering projects that were otherwise exempt. And can you help me understand kind of how you see this facilitating that work if we're now covering a whole new category of work?
Yeah, so, thank you. I will say that there's two ways that we're thinking about this, and Serena, if you're online and would like to jump in, I would invite you to do, as you do, a much better job of explaining legal issues than I do. But the basic issue here is there are two aspects to this permit that we're looking at. One is the 401, the water quality certification process. And there, I think it's clear that what we're doing is trying to create another general permit that would streamline what would otherwise be an individual certification process. And in our mind, that is clear streamlining. Now, we need to be clear and transparent that we are also looking at upland activities, in part because part of what we're seeing as the significant impacts to water quality are coming from some of the upland activities specifically related to road work. In some cases, the utility companies have argued in the past that this is maintenance of existing facilities, any work going on with the right-of-way. Frankly, we reject that argument, and this is and our permit is a way to ensure that in rejecting that argument, we don't leave you guys with a requirement to come up with individual waste discharges.
Thanks for that. That's helpful. You mentioned you're seeing significant impacts to water quality from some of this work. Could you maybe speak to or point me to anything in the record that demonstrates any of the analysis you guys have done that shows water quality impacts from the covered project activities?
Yeah, we have several enforcement actions that I could refer to. I don't know that that's something I want to go into in this particular forum, but if you'd like to follow up with us, I'm sure we can provide you some additional information, and we do discuss it in our staff report.
In the EIR.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will say, just again, as we're going through the presentation, we've included some pictures of just that within the presentation.
So that you're citing to, notices of violation or cleanup and abatement orders that are related to pre-wildfire operations and maintenance work from electric utilities, or what's
well, not exclusively to that. Again, our authority comes from the discharge of waste into waters of the state, or the threat of discharge from waters of the state. This work, by its very nature, has quite a bit of land disturbing activity and waste generating activity that occurs close to or within waters of the state. So I don't think we need to necessarily point to an activity to justify our ability to generate this type of a permit. However, if we were asked to, we could.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I haven't seen that in the record here, that there was a history of violations related to utility maintenance and operations work. So I thought it might be helpful to clarify that. I'll defer to others if there's others that have questions.
I'll need to talk to my legal. I'm not sure we would want to discuss ongoing enforcement cases within the context of a permit development process.
Yeah, that makes sense, but there are some online, correct? There's a database of NOVs and cleanup and abatement orders. So those should be easy to reference.
I'll talk with my attorney about that.
Okay. If others have questions, I can wait on my couple follow-ups.
Thanks, Josh. I don't see any other hands up right now. So I think you're free to continue on. I don't see any questions in the chat either. So I think you're free to continue if you have more questions.
Yeah, I was just gonna maybe turn to the cost discussion piece. You had mentioned that you hadn't estimated the number of projects or the cost and weren't really in a position to do that. And that makes sense. I guess my question maybe as a follow-up would be, when your staff was developing the cost discussion and the response to comments, did you coordinate or consult with any of the utility stakeholders when you were considering developing that section?
We have had ongoing discussions with the utility, with members of the utility industry for up to a few months ago, for better part of a year, trying to identify ways to get GIS information about where projects are located. This is something that we have definitely reached out to the utility companies about. If there is better information about this, we would really like to know. So this is something where, yes, we have reached out. I don't think that we've gotten the kind of information that would be practically useful for us. If you have such information, we would be eager to speak with you about it. I also want to be clear, while we don't have the number of projects that might be impacted, that's not to say that we haven't done any cost analysis, and there is some cost analysis that was included as part of our most recent release. It is a per site cost analysis. It's not a statewide cost analysis, though.
So maybe I missed that. What can you refer me to which document that's in?
Gene, I'm gonna hand that off to you. Where is that? I think it's at the end of our response. Is that correct?
The cost discussion is at the end of the document.
Yeah, the response to comments document.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I did catch that. Thank you. But I didn't see per project cost estimate in that section. It seemed more high level.
It is high level, yes.
But you did do some kind of per project cost estimate that's just not reflected in that document.
What I consider cost project specific might be different from what you consider. So I'm just going to say that the estimate that we have done is at the end of the response to comments.
Okay. I guess
I just want to add one thing here, Josh, that, we recognize there's a certain amount of uncertainty on the number of activities that would be covered by the scope of the general order. And if the board chooses to adopt the order, we've already had discussions about coming back to the board to discuss the number of covered activities to make sure that that's something that staff are staying well informed on. At this point, there have been several revisions, as Paul mentioned, to reduce the number of covered activities and focus on those with the highest threat to water quality. And if we've really missed the mark there, then that's something that we can revisit at a later date once we have true numbers based on the number of enrollees.
Yeah, and let me throw in just a repetition of some things that we discussed on Monday, which is, at the end of the day, our intention here is not to create a new significant permitting process. Our intention here is to provide a baseline of management practices that we think is reasonable for utility companies to include as they're doing their work. We're trying to, in as much as possible, do that without any significant paperwork burden on the part of the utility companies. There are some instances where we think it's important for us to be in the process before work happens. A good example of that is wherever there's a waste discharge to a water of the state, because that invokes 404 permitting potentially, and that's where we have water quality certification responsibilities. Those are the kind of things that we really need to know about things before the work happens. We are also asking that there be sufficient record keeping so that we have some idea of where this permit is being utilized. But for the most part, we're trying to keep the administrative process as thin and light as possible. We recognize that this is something that the utility companies are being tasked with doing more of. We support this work. We recognize that this is critical emergency work. We too, on the water board side, are limited in terms of the resources, and we are not trying to create a significant resource burden either internally or externally. So again, when we submitted the first draft, what we heard from people was that, hey, there were going to be thousands of notices of intent submitted. And we didn't feel like we had to do much digging to agree that yes, that was the case and that was not our intention. And we've made some adjustments as a result. We think we have hit a sweeter spot. If we have not, we are very much interested in knowing that, because it is not in our interest to create a large administrative burden on either the utility companies or on the state. Having said that, we do want to make sure that the playing field is level and well understood, and that there are reasonable and appropriate management practices that are appropriately implemented and audited.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate that sentiment. Yeah. I am trying to refrain from public comment due to the instructions on the workshop, but I will just say, I appreciate your responses to my questions today, and then I guess my final maybe question comment here is, I did, I appreciate your feedback there. I was a little bit discouraged to see there's a statement in the cost discussion that suggests that ongoing costs would be minimal or negligible, and I, maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but it was, I think what we have been saying consistently is that the costs for this are hard to get our arms around, but every discussion I've had is that this would be extremely expensive to comply with.
Just help me out, Josh. Is that extremely expensive because it would require new practices, or extremely expensive because of the administrative burden?
Well, I don't know what is encompassed by administrative burden, but I will say that the number of projects that will come within the scope of this, the way that this is structured, even if it's a minimal cost, but it's 10,000 times, it adds up really quickly, and that's not, those are not obviously hard and fast numbers, but that's where we get back to maybe centering our concerns on scope and cost, because this really escalates. But I'll looks like there's other commenters, so I'll step away. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay, looks like it doesn't show an order that hands were raised, so I'll just go top to bottom. So I guess next we'll do Kyler.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I have a question related to the construction general permit and sort of closing the gap on that maintenance exemption. Oh, can't get that word out of my mouth, that you were mentioning, Paul. And I guess I'm coming back to, why is that now being pursued under this general order rather than incorporated into the recently revised construction general permit? It seems like that might be a more appropriate vehicle to regulate land disturbance activities. Just curious why it's being pursued as a general order rather than from within the CGP itself.
Thank you. The short answer to that is we had some internal discussions along that very nature with the CGP staff, and for a number of different reasons, not the least of which was that the opinion of the CGP staff that the CGP is just not really well suited, or it was not designed for maintenance of rural roadways. That's a little bit of a different animal from what they typically look at. That updating the CGP was not the best path forward, and there were other considerations as well. But the bottom line is, after discussion with the CGP folks, we felt it was better to go down this path instead of a modification of the CGP.
Right. And yeah, I guess I'm also struggling, like maybe others, just trying to rectify, and some of the statements that have been made are causing some dissonance. I'm hearing that, you want utilities to do our work in an expedited fashion and protect water quality, and support, the scale and pace of wildfire mitigation activities. But there's also cases where it seems like this general order would, in fact, impede those stated goals. So I'm just having trouble rectifying some of the dissonant statements that have been made. So, and it gets back to sort of this upland activities that would be regulated by the general order encumbered. And I guess I'm seeing it from a different perspective, that this general order wouldn't really facilitate upland work. It might streamline the 401 certification process, as you've mentioned, by reducing individual permits. I don't know, can you offer any sort of clarifications that might help me, understand this a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a tension that we've honestly struggled with on our side as well. But when we step back and look at the scale of work that's being done across the landscape, we can't help but recognize the potential threats to water quality. And the instances where we're regulating upland activities are only if there's a half acre of soil disturbance. And it's really hard for us to even picture where there's a half acre of soil disturbance where you're not likely to already cross the waters, which would implicate the permit in other instances. So for those reasons, given that's a large amount of soil disturbance on steep slopes and erodible soil, that's the only instances where we're pulling in projects that aren't access road construction projects, which is something we've talked about length and tried to be really transparent about our water quality concerns there, given some of the poor conditions that we've seen roads being developed under, that we thought that it was appropriate to set the scope as we have. But we definitely welcome comments that you have on where we've missed the mark and balancing that tension with reasonableness on your side.
Okay, well, yeah, and thanks for pointing it out. That you also see that tension, and it's just something I've been trying to, wrap my head around. And I guess my only follow-up question is regarding, I don't know, maybe the definition of uplands, but I would suggest that any work outside the boundaries of an aquatic resource isn't upland. So, and this general order also extends, 50 feet from waters. So those also seems like a, additional workload, an additional burden for those activities beyond those performed, in waters.
Yeah,
is that consistent with your definition of upland? Just want to be clear there.
Yeah, so first of all, there's a jurisdictional question there, and then there's an implementation question there. So we would agree with you that in most cases, the jurisdictional boundary is consistent with the core. However, when you read the 401 certification process, we are authorized to and do routinely look at the whole of a project, not just the part that's being addressed within the waters. So when we started developing this, and perhaps this is more background than you need, but I think it's relevant to the issues that you brought up. when we started developing this, we had a question before us of, do we address, how much of the utilities activities do we address? And we had a couple of different options, one of which was we could look at only the portion that would be addressed by the 401 certification, which again, for anything that invokes a 404 permit, would include the whole of the project, which would include all of the way uphill for a specific project. The second option that we could look at was we could explicitly exclude anything that, you know, all of the work except what was explicitly included in the CGP. And for our purposes, that's the path that we've gone to. If it's included under the CGP is a much more protective permit. In most cases, we're satisfied that if you follow the CGP, you will be more than compliant with the conditions that we're trying to put in place. The third option would be to try and do a single permit for all of the utility work and essentially have a single place for the utilities to go for all their permitting needs. While that would be wonderful to do, there were some legal constraints that prevented us from doing that. So when you talk about this tension of looking up to upland activities and where that jurisdictional boundary lies, just remember that we routinely, as we do with any of your 401 certifications, look at the whole of the project. We could have stopped there, but it left us a hole in the middle, and we were hearing from the regional boards and seeing with our own experience that there were some significant water quality activities that were happening that were outside of any 404 permit and that merited the need for waste discharge requirements. And it didn't seem appropriate for us to try and run two permit paths in parallel rather than just trying to lump them under one permit.
Thanks for that. I think I'll defer to others with questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
I see the next hand up is Susie. So Susie, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. So I'm sorry, Paul and Jean, I know you mentioned where this was, and I if you could just repeat for me where to find a more detailed analysis of what the actual costs were that you included. And what I'm trying to figure out is because we've figured, and you did in your cost discussion analysis acknowledge that there would be a disproportionately higher cost for the rural electric cooperatives, but we're finding that's a huge cost for us for projects that weren't previously part of the scope of rules and which permits weren't obtained for. So I'm just trying to get a better feel of the numbers that you were using and the analysis you did so that we could be sure that our analysis is an apples to apples one.
That's hard to do without knowing the details of what you're looking at. I think the easiest thing for me to tell you is that the analysis that we have, which is admittedly high level, is included at the end of that responses to comments. We would invite you to give us comments about how we might also look at this, and we would be open to considering that. And if there's concerns about your specific analysis and how we might ensure that there's an apples to apples comparison done there, that might be a better discussion for an offline conversation. We're happy to have that with you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So it is that narrative at the end of the Q&A
Yes.
document that you're referring to, because that's where because that's where I saw where you did have the conclusion about, the cooperatives and whatnot, but I wasn't sure which numbers. So, okay, thank you very much. We'll likely need to follow up offline then. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Currently, thank you, Susie. Currently, I see Rick Haywood has his hand up next. Rick?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to try and I asked a question the other day and I just wanted to maybe ask it a hopefully better way. But first, I want to just kind of say to the board, I think looking at the revisions you guys made versus the first draft, it is appreciated that you really did take a lot of our input to heart and changed a lot of the language in it. So just so you know that we do recognize it. So I guess my question is really on implementation related to kind of other permitting paths where the general order is saying if you have an existing general order like a pre-cert or something that would apply for the work, you have to use that. And I guess the example I used was polls the other day, but like for example, if we had road work that would otherwise qualify for this general order, but now we have a hard crossing that a new hard crossing we have to install or to significantly rebuild that would qualify for, or that would need a 404. How would this general order kind of overlap with a need for that individual 404 on top of the other, say, upland work? Would we need to file, I guess, like one general order for this and then the 404 for the water work, or would that general order apply for both activities?
The goal is that you would only need to apply for the nationwide permit general order. Of course, it depends on how far out you're describing work from the trigger for the 404. So there's a line to be drawn there. Historically, we look to the utilities for defining projects because you're the one doing the planning, and we review applications as they are received. So when a project's proposed that has in-water work and ancillary access road work is described within that same application, or additional infrastructure is being constructed within that same application, we look at that information, we evaluate all the related activities in full under the CEQA definition of a project, which is the whole of an action. So we take that broader perspective, and from that perspective, it's appropriate to say, hey, what we're picturing is evaluating those activities, so polls within and near waters under that single nationwide permit application. Of course, if you were going to group many activities that would require coverage under the utility general order and there's no in-water work, it's going to make sense to apply under the utility wildfire general order. So it's also just a part of it depends situation. But our intent is to require as few applications as possible.
No, right on. And I guess to that point, like for Edison, I mean, our road work, we don't look at feet, we look at miles for projects. So it would be more of a holistic look at a large segment of road, say hypothetically just a 10-mile stretch of road that would be within that buffer for the waters of the state. So it would trigger the general order. But then I guess my question is, would the general order be used to certify that nationwide permit?
We will be relying on the general order. Yeah, so the general order does have a 401 component. So, if it makes sense to seek certification coverage for multiple activities where for that 10-mile stretch, maybe the nationwide permit threshold has been exceeded, then the general order will still provide certification.
Rick, it might be useful to know that while we have pre-certified a certain number of nationwide permits, the scope of those certifications are pretty narrow, and that's largely related to CEQA limitations and some of the other limitations we have coming out of the federal regulations. So if you can use our pre-certified nationwide 57, that would be your first avenue because you're getting a 404 permit from the Corps, and the Corps is going to say, hey, this has already been certified. So that's okay, but we expect that in many cases, because our pre-certification is so limited, that you will need some other form of certification. And we are hopeful that this certification, this permit that we're pulling together, can serve as that alternative certification that should really streamline our processes.
Okay, and like looking forward, would it the next round of nationwides when they come out, would this be that? Would you guys look to be certifying nationwides under this or as a general certification?
You know, that's a really good question. We're talking about that internally. We have heard from the Corps that we should be expecting the next round of nationwide permits to be released for certification sometime this fall. If we can, again, we're always looking for ways to expand our certification of the nationwide permits. And if we can use this certification as a way to do that, or this permit as a way to increase our certifications, I think that's the path we would go. But first, we've got to see the nationwide permits that come out. We'll have to have some discussions with the Corps of Engineers. There's a lot of nuanced changes that are happening that have happened or we expect to happen to the Code of Regulations. So there's a lot of unknowns there. But yeah,
Sure.
Our intention is always to drive towards fewer permits, not more.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you. And I'll end it there, but I'll just say, we share a lot of the same concerns you heard today from other folks too. And as part of our response to comments, we're hoping to provide you more data on kind of the things you're asking about, like on the hard numbers for some of the work that we're concerned about as well. So
yeah,
thanks.
Again, we are actually on the same page with you about the concerns about administrative costs. We don't have a lot of people to implement this on our side. So, if we're missing the mark and we're still at thousands of projects requiring NOIs, we need to know that. That's not something that we as staff are shooting for, nor do I think we have the support of our board there. So we definitely want something thin and light.
Right on. Yeah, and we won't be shy. So thanks.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect you to be.
The last point I'll add to this discussion is we do have, we describe the option for programmatic coverage of access route activities in the utility wildfire general order. So we'd like to encourage that roads are thought of holistically and how to comply with principles of disconnection to ensure that waters don't form within the roadway is something that's always kept in mind. It might make sense in the long run for utilities to provide, to seek coverage for, long lengths of roads, as you described, Rick, under a single application and or even service area wide, under that alternative option that satisfies the erosion and sediment control plan requirement in the utility wildfire general order. So if that box is already checked, then it's checked.
Gene, I wanna flesh that out a little bit because there's some insider baseball that they wouldn't know about that I think is worth sharing. When we first started this program, one of the debates that we had internally was, hey, should we just require a road maintenance plan from the utility companies and not require any enrollment of specific projects? We ultimately rejected that path for some legal and feasibility reasons, but one of the reasons is we weren't certain that we could require that, but we do see that could be an attractive option both for the regional boards and for the utility companies. And so we have been very careful to include as far back as the administrative draft, an option for a programmatic enrollment where you guys have the option to go talk to the regional boards and say, hey, rather than going through this individual project by project enrollment, we have this cohort of projects that all fall under the same thing. Let us submit it to you once and be done with it. And we have been careful to include that as an option. It is there. We've struggled to get that message out, but I want to make sure that you guys know it is there.
And I not to speak for everybody, I can just say for myself that, yeah, we did notice it and you guys have raised kind of the spotlight onto it. So it is appreciated. Honestly, my biggest concern really is it's not even necessarily the permitting front, it's the non-notifying and the vegetation work, because, I think Josh might have said it, like it's a small amount of labor per effort, but there's a whole lot of them And, instead of looking at maybe thousands of NOIs, it's tens or more thousands of category A projects that we still have to work through the numbers, but that really raise a lot of concern. So, but you'll see it in the comments.
So we're totally open to talking to you guys about that. But I would ask that when you provide that information, please be careful to include not just how many, but where you came up with those numbers. And more importantly, what is it that you see as driving the cost? Because we just aren't seeing it. And I'm not
Sure.
saying it's not there. I'm just saying we're not seeing it. And so help us to see it. We're happy to work with you. Again, we do have some baseline water quality management things that we think are reasonable and appropriate. But we're not trying to create, we're not trying to create the next Mount Rushmore.
No, right on. And you had said that before, and I took it to heart. So I can assure you, we're going to try and be as I don't know what the word is, but as forthcoming as we can to really demonstrate those concerns and the numbers.
I will tell you the places where we as staff are pretty firm. Now, I want to be really clear. This is we as staff. We don't speak for the board. The board speaks for itself. Obviously, we are in communication with exec, and we like to think that we know how to channel our board, but ultimately it's the board that's going to make the decision. Based on the information that we have today, the places where we feel we have support to be firm is we do think that there's a need to look not just at the in-water work, but also the upland work. We do see a number of issues with roadway and roadway management. We think there ought to be some reasonable and appropriate mitigation measures that go beyond what we see today. So those are a couple of the areas where we think we have support, and we think we have support from the board to move forward with that. Again, how we get there, we can be completely flexible about that.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Rick. I'm looking at the chat right now, and I see no questions in chat and no hands raised. So does anybody have any questions? You can go ahead and take your question immediately if you guys have one. Okay, I'm seeing no questions and no hands, so we can go ahead and end the meeting now. As a quick reminder, comments are due on April 29th by 5 p.m. You are also free to reach out to myself or Jean or Paul if you have further questions or want to discuss more regarding the order. But please make sure that if you have comments to submit, that you do submit those by 5 p.m. on April 29th. Thank you all, and we appreciate everyone who attended. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.